Well, good morning, all. Welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. Just a few introductions before we get started today and some reminders. Next week's talk will be early identification and diagnosis of axial spondyloarthritis. That talk will be given by rheumatologist Dr. Saman Kwalkar. And just a few logistics. I'm actually here back in Southern Auditorium at Providence St. Vincent Medical Center. And a reminder that Grand Rounds is now in collaboration with Providence Portland. Much of our audience remains on the Teams Live platform, but we will continue to send notice of an opportunity to start to attend live in the auditorium. You can earn CME credit by being with us live or live on Teams, or by watching a recording of the event, which is available at the same link as the invite for today's Grand Round. I'll be monitoring Q&A throughout the session today, so please do go ahead and post any comments or questions. I'll mostly save those until the end as time permits. And now to introduce our speaker. We're joined today by Dr. Brian Cheesebro, the Oregon Region Medical Director of Environmental Stewardship for Providence Health and Services. Dr. Cheesebro earned his medical degree from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and then went on to do residency training in anesthesiology and perioperative care at University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Cheesebro currently practices anesthesiology with Oregon Anesthesiology Group at Providence Portland Medical Center. And in addition, he serves as the Vice Chair of the American Society of Anesthesiologists Committee on Environmental Health. He volunteers as a medical advisor for Portland Mountain Rescue in Portland, Oregon. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Cheesebro today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. This is a complicated topic to try to cover in a single hour, and I'll do my best to try and kind of scratch the surface today with more of a high-level view. And really, I look to discuss the intersections between climate and health, as well as our approach in Providence addressing these issues. And then finally, finally at the end, I'll introduce a framework and some strategies for clinician engagement and involvement to help build both a health for a better world and a better world for health. So this statement here from the World Health Organization, I think sums up the issue pretty well. Climate change is the single biggest health threat facing humanity. And this is where we are. This is not future projection. I think any of us living in the Northwest over the past couple of years has seen this firsthand. It's happening now, and it appears to be ramping up. And the health impacts of climate vary. They vary across both geography and across time. And these concepts here that I've listed really help ground our perspective within these dynamic systems that vary over time and space. And really the impacts are determined by a combination of exposures to climate and environmental threats, conditions or hazards. And those exposures occur on patients, populations, and the health system itself. These exposures kind of intersect with vulnerabilities of each of these groups, and together that determines the impact. Adaptation aims to reduce the risk of both exposure and vulnerability. And over the short and medium term, going forward, really these exposures, vulnerability, inherent resilience to the current rate of climate change, as well as our ability to adapt both in breadth and speed. That's what really determines our health, climate health impacts over the short and midterm. Obviously, over the long term, it's all of those things again, plus the work we're taking on to mitigate and reduce the primary problem, which are the buildup of greenhouse gas emissions, in order to prevent crossing these irreversible climate tipping points. And healthcare, within the context of the climate crisis, healthcare really occupies a very unique role. And I think of it really as this vicious cycle, this healthcare environment cycle. If we start on the green side, healthcare delivery, that's what we do every day. That's our mission, to take care of patients and populations, and we deliver healthcare. That healthcare inherently has its own emissions burden. We generate a tremendous amount of pollution, which goes out into the environment and leads to illness and injury. It combines with the societal emissions and pollution. And I'll talk a little bit later about kind of the proportion of healthcare pollution and emissions within the grander scheme. But all of the pollution, all of the emissions combine to drive illness and injury. And we as healthcare, as an industry, are this anchor network receiving patients who come back to us looking for treatment in response to these impacts. Generates more healthcare delivery, generates more pollution and emissions, generates more illness, and we get stuck in this cycle. And our goal in healthcare sustainability and in our environmental stewardship program is to work to break this vicious, unhealthy cycle at each of these points. Each point kind of requires a different kind of pillar of action, is kind of what I call them. If we start in the illness and injury, that's where we think about adaptation and building resilience in patients, populations, and the health system itself. There's a lot of work that we'll talk about in a second there. In terms of healthcare delivery, there's a tremendous effort underway to reduce our pollution, to reduce our emissions burden through mitigation. And then finally, when we talk about climate change more broadly, pollution more broadly, that's where advocacy really comes into play, advocating externally and internally, but more externally to call attention to the health impacts of climate, to the issues related to environmental health, to really spur and lead society as an anchor institution to take action to help improve the health of our planet. So we'll start we will start at adaptation. It's kind of a tongue twister. And this is the intersection between health and the environment. As we've seen over the past several years, there's some feedback coming. I don't know if you can turn that off. Thank you. Over the past several years, even locally or regionally, with wildfires, the smoke, the extreme heat dome that we saw last year, drought, think more broadly across the United States, the excessive rain events in the Southeast, flooding, hurricanes along the Gulf Coast and up the East Coast. I mean, the list just keeps going on and on. And we're experiencing the health impacts of these events today. So we need to consider, again, what I was talking about before, the short-term time horizon and these health impacts of climate. And again, as I mentioned before, these impacts are determined by this combination of exposures and vulnerabilities. And walking through from left to right, we start with kind of these primary, kind of sometimes hard to make the link between these big climate drivers and health. And this is important to understand not only for ourselves, but when we talk to our patients and our colleagues and others in society, this is kind of a good way to lead them through so that they really understand the link between climate and health. And climate drivers lead to environmental conditions, which can generate environmental hazards, which result in these detrimental health effects. And the conditions and hazards, they can either be a primary injury or they can act as a threat multiplier so that patients with chronic disease or other vulnerabilities, the environmental conditions or the climate impacts can tip them over and exacerbate their underlying conditions. Again, those that suffer the most are the most vulnerable amongst us. I personally am pretty deliberate about thinking through carefully vulnerabilities amongst patients, populations in the health system. I've said that a couple of times. I'll say it more because I think the approach, the assessment of vulnerability amongst those three groups is different. The actions to support resilience amongst those three groups are also different. In the table below, kind of listed just two examples that kind of highlight this concept of driver to condition to hazard to effect. And I also wanted to make the point that there's overlap. Just they don't stay on their row. You know, increased temperature, excessive heat, that plays a role in exacerbating drought, exacerbating wildfires. So it actually gets pretty complicated. It's not so clean as just a table with straight across rows. It's actually more of a there are a lot of arrows going a lot of different directions, but it does help, I think, to have some framework to start to break apart many of these complicated interactions. Again, stepping back to assess overall impacts of just these two, looking at some data. These are two that we've experienced pretty intensely here in the Northwest. When assessed globally, the particulate air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels is responsible for 8.7 million premature deaths per year, which is a tremendous number, right? And really calls attention to the need to address the burning of fossil fuels as the primary driver of so many of these problems. While other people have looked at more broadly, tried to quantify the impacts of extreme heat, and they've determined that temperature-related mortality cost of carbon, which is with extreme heat, which is really considered to be the most dangerous environmental hazard. We find that for every roughly 4,500 metric tons of carbon generates one excess death. Last summer, obviously, we saw many in that 1 week of the extreme heat dome event. We saw many people unfortunately pass away, and you know, we're driving it through our emissions with Providence and society as a whole. Just about every level, globally, nationally, even locally here in Portland, we see that the environmental determinants of health disproportionately impact the poor and the vulnerable. With extreme heat, again, last year, that came into play with these large urban temperature gradients between neighborhoods, resulting in much greater levels of exposure to those living in these urban heat islands. One of our colleagues at Portland State last year during that heat event went around and took very detailed temperature measurements during the heat dome and generated this map that we're looking at here. I found it really remarkable to learn that, you know, the temperature gradient between North Portland and Irvington, which is, you know, less than a mile apart, that temperature gradient was about 25 degrees Fahrenheit difference. I don't think it will surprise many in the audience to also notice in this image the red temperature. These urban heat islands are also overlap with many of the regions that were historically redlined in Portland. And in addition to these direct exposures, the pre-existing health disparities within these communities also contribute to increased vulnerability, again, allowing extreme heat to act as a threat multiplier and exacerbating these chronic medical conditions. And as I mentioned before, environmental and climate health impacts really vary across geography and time. Not all regions of the country are gonna battle wildfires the way we are or the way California is. Nor will the continent or the globe experience the same environmental conditions, therefore hazards, therefore health effects. Nor will the vulnerabilities amongst these different populations and patients be the same. So each region really needs to carefully whoa, sorry, shot way ahead. Needs to carefully consider its own vulnerabilities to build resilience to what is predicted to be the most severe, most likely threats. Insurance companies are also kind of getting into the mix in this, trying to predict regional climate and environmental risks. It doesn't mean that these are the only risks to consider. This is an assessment county by county done by Moody's, which is a big insurance company. But these are what, through their analysis, they felt to be the most severe risks for each of these counties. We're seeing many of these play out today and over the past couple of years. I think it's interesting to note for us in Oregon, while I've talked about our experience with extreme heat and wildfires and air quality, that, at least according to Moody's assessment, is not what they are predicting to be the greatest environmental or climate-related risk to us. It's actually excessive rain, rain events like our communities in the Southeast have been experiencing over the past year, what we've seen in Europe and Asia. That's what's predicted to impact us. Hopefully that doesn't happen. We'll see. As a result of these big differences, again, the responses will and should be different, in wildfire-prone California or Southern Oregon, as opposed to the communities across the Gulf Coast as they prepare to adapt to increased severity and frequency of hurricanes. But really, as disparate as those may seem to be, they both fall under this umbrella of climate, health, adaptation, and resilience. So in addition to assessing the risk of the climate drivers and the conditions and the hazards, it's also important to more systematically address vulnerabilities in our again, patients, populations, and health system. Here in Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority assesses climate and health vulnerabilities across multiple factors. They look at age, socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, degree of isolation. We certainly saw last year with the heat, those patients who really suffered the most were the elderly who lived in isolation. So that's something that's called out specifically. The presence of chronic disease, education level, all of those kind of combine to give a sense of a community's vulnerability to climate and health. Other states have similar assessment tools, and while none of them are really perfect, they do help provide some direction in terms of thinking about the risk to populations. And in terms of patients, we really need clinicians to be thinking along these same lines as you're meeting with your patients in clinic or in the hospital, preparing them for discharge. Think carefully about their vulnerabilities to the environment that they're either living in or being discharged to. So we have some insight into our national and state vulnerabilities. Our next step in Providence is to really dig more deeply into our opportunities through more Providence-based assessments into our specific regions, communities, and facilities. We're interested in advancing knowledge in this space through research. There's a tremendous amount that we know about climate and health and adaptation and tools for building resilience, but I would argue there's even more that we do not know. And this field is in desperate need of active research and innovation. For example, as an anesthesiologist 2 years ago during the big fires of Labor Day 2020, I very clearly remember standing in the hall at Prov Portland with smoke, visible smoke in the hall, wondering with colleagues and talking about what patients should we postpone? What surgery should we postpone? How do we assess risk in this environment that none of us have ever worked in before? We don't have any evidence to help guide us. We did the best that we could, but I think that we really need to think carefully about how to risk assess and optimize in a rapidly changing environment and in ways that we have not seen before. That's kind of a pretty high overview of adaptation and resilience. To assess the impacts of healthcare delivery on climate and the environment, we really need to focus on mitigation of our own emissions and our own pollution to really live up to this ethos of first do no harm. It's not going to be a revelation to anyone here that U.S. healthcare is enormous, right? It's an enormous industry. It's very resource intense. Shouldn't come as a surprise that the environmental impacts of healthcare is also enormous. Sadly, here in the United States, our healthcare system emissions and pollution are disproportionately large compared to other nations' health systems. If you look at U.S. healthcare as an industry, we generate roughly 8.5% of our national greenhouse gas emissions burden. If you look at healthcare globally, the United States contributes 25% of global healthcare emissions. Interestingly, an assessment of U.S. healthcare pollution on morbidity and mortality is measured by disability-adjusted life years, found that that health impact of our own pollution creates injury on the same order of magnitude as preventable medical errors, which obviously and justifiably has garnered tons of attention from healthcare. This problem is of equal magnitude, and in my opinion, deserves equal, if not more, attention. In order to really understand mitigation and to start kind of unraveling emissions, we need to get some sense about carbon accounting. This is something that I did not learn in medical school or residency. It's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. But there are protocols for assessing and accounting carbon. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is an international standard, accounting standard, and they really it divides carbon amongst 3 different scopes. Scope 1 are carbon emissions that are direct. They're emitted directly from campus or facility. Within healthcare, that means the burning of natural gas for thermal energy. It means inhaled anesthetic emissions. It means emissions from fleet vehicles, refrigerant losses, things like that. Scope 2 emissions are indirect utility-based emissions, largely through procurement of electricity or steam. So for that, it's really about how efficiently are we using electricity, and what's the energy mix on our electrical grid. Scope 3 is everything else. It's kind of the catch-all group. Indirect emissions, those are associated with supply chain, transportation, waste management, food and nutrition. It all kind of gets lumped into this Scope 3 category. The figure on the right is a breakdown in the U.S. of national healthcare emissions by source and scope. You can see that roughly 80% of healthcare-related emissions lie within Scope 3, with 20% falling in Scopes 1 and 2. It's not so. Well, I often encounter people who really are focused on the emissions generated from our facilities, thinking about lights, thinking about windows and insulation and all that. Super important, but it's not all wrapped up in our facilities. And clinicians, through our clinical decision making, our delivery of care, we have a huge role to play in addressing this Scope 3 burden of emissions. This is another way of looking at it to assess opportunity and to direct effort. This analysis comes from the UK National Health Service. They're really, in terms of health systems, they are the global leader in working toward net zero healthcare and decarbonization. And here we're looking at a projection of their system broken down not necessarily by scopes, but rather by different categories of action and accountability. So if you look at purple on the top section, that's really action that's needed by national and international bodies, looking at decarbonization of the grid, or building, improving vehicle efficiencies and moving toward electrical EV transportation systems. Whereas green, right below that, that's looking at new models of preventative medicine. I'll talk a little bit later about the principles of sustainable healthcare. Blue, I have to kind of point at myself. Anesthetics and inhalers, the propellants that are within metered dose inhalers are another significant source of healthcare-related greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation and travel, estates, facilities, and then the bottom is, that's largely the supply chain, and that's really kind of the holy grail of Scope 3 mitigation that we're working hard to unravel and make progress on. So what are we doing in Providence? Hopefully you've heard by now that Providence has publicly and formally committed to becoming carbon negative by 2030. This is a pretty aggressive goal. As Dr. Hochman says here in this quote, it is the boldest climate goal in healthcare in the United States. We don't take it lightly. It's a lot of work. It's very ambitious. But we're proud of it and we're committed to it and we're working hard to achieve it. And this kind of support across the entire institution has been really helpful in terms of building the culture that we need to make these advancements in stewardship. And our as a mission-based, values-based organization, our program is really grounded in the Providence mission and values, particularly justice, where we do strive to care wisely for our people, our resources, and our earth, and we stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable. When you look back at those other slides and see all those different categories and these scopes and, different facets of action, at least for me at the beginning, I found it to be totally overwhelming. And where do you even start? It's hard to wrap your head around what to do. Within Providence, we built this kind of framework that we call the We Act for environmental stewardship, and it helps guide our work. It helps kind of categorize effort and action, and it helps engage others. It's both a mnemonic, so we can remember what categories to address, but it also reminds us what we need to do, which is to take action. We estimate that across these 5 categories, broadly speaking, we're covering just shy of 90% of our Providence emissions. And we're really working in waste. We're really thinking about upstream waste reduction as well as downstream waste reduction. It's not just about recycling. It's more effective to work upstream. It's called source reduction, reduce the amount of material and resource consumption from the get-go. Energy and water, we're looking at the more efficient use of energy and water resources, as well as trying to decrease the carbon intensity of those sources. So kind of an overarching concept would be use less and green the rest. And I think that applies to all of these categories. In agriculture and food, we're looking at and measuring the carbon intensity of the meals that we serve, both to patients and in our cafeterias. And we're trying to support more sustainable agricultural choices. With chemicals, we're looking at trying to change practices to use fewer, less toxic, lower carbon emission chemicals. And in transportation, we're looking at trying to reduce our transportation demand as well as reduce the carbon intensity of the forms of travel that we use. So environmental stewardship really, it touches just about every aspect of healthcare that you can imagine. And the scale is gigantic. And in order to know what we need to do, we need to make an assessment, and we need to be able to track where we are, where we're going, and how we're doing on the journey. So we desperately need data. So over the past year or so, we've been working really hard with Providence caregivers at the Providence Global Center in India to build a central database of environmental stewardship data to track resources to like energy and water, anesthesia, utilization of certain classes of clinical supplies. We're working on pulling food procurement into this scorecard, and we're looking at use, we're translating it to emissions, and we're also looking at the financial implications of these practices. This tool has been really helpful in directing effort, kind of looking, developing kind of a heat map, not only in terms of content, but where in Providence do we need to be focusing our efforts? 7 states, 53, 54 hospitals. We can't all be everywhere at once. So we're really trying to prioritize content and geography in our mitigation work. Of course, it's more complicated than an easy to remember mnemonic like We Act. And this strategy diagram outlines the work that we're doing, not only across the 3 pillars on the right-hand side, but also it's pointing out the different groups, the action groups that are working on these topics, as well as what we consider key elements for success in working toward this overarching goal that we have in the center there, becoming carbon negative. There's a lot to do. Every time I look at this, my eyes kind of go cross-eyed. The 3rd pillar is advocacy. And clearly, while healthcare emissions and pollution, it's significant without question, we're part of a much larger problem. We contribute to this global societal problem, and to address the overarching issues, we need to be working outside of our walls within the societal commons to engage partners to continue to drive down emissions and pollution. So here I'm just kind of highlighting some of our external advocacy that we've done in Providence. We've been directly advocating for climate action at all levels of government and organization. Globally, Providence was on one of the stages at COP26 last fall in Glasgow, talking about the importance of decarbonizing healthcare, the impacts of climate and health. Interestingly, coming out of that meeting, out of COP26, there is a COP26 health program, which was signed on by roughly 50 countries, including the United States, pledging to work toward decarbonizing healthcare and building resilience into our health systems. Federally, the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity recently put forth a decarbonization pledge that Providence was one of the first health systems to sign on to. On Thursday, Beth Schenk, who's our Executive Director of Environmental Stewardship at Providence, is testifying in person in front of the U.S. House Ways and Means Committee on healthcare decarbonization and the importance of building resilience into our healthcare systems. People within our program have testified in front of state legislatures, both Oregon and Washington, and locally we're working with municipalities, Portland and Seattle in particular, in their work toward decarbonizing our cities. So where do clinicians fit into all of this? It's a big, as I've mentioned before, it's a big topic. Clinicians represent the majority of employees or caregivers in healthcare organizations. Here in Providence, it's estimated roughly 70–80% of caregivers are clinicians or patient-facing. We know from survey data that clinicians are engaged around this topic. By and large, we recognize the threat of climate change on human health today and the risk that it poses going forward. And clinicians are motivated to take action, but there are barriers that we all face. Most significantly, it's a lack of time. I'm sure everyone here feels time pressure. And it's a lack of detailed or specific knowledge about what to do. If any of you had training like mine, this was never discussed in my medical school training or residency training. I didn't learn, this is not something that is kind of ingrained into healthcare education or operations yet. Hopefully that changes, but that is also a significant barrier. So for clinicians who are busy, I think it helps to have a framework to help to think through these issues and opportunities to guide engagement and action. As an anesthesiologist, I really like these kind of frameworks as opposed to memorizing long lists of differential diagnoses. So this I find helpful. Hopefully it's helpful for you. So across the top, the columns are the pillars that we talked about. It's mitigation, it's adaptation, it's advocacy. And the rows highlight different strategies that I think are particularly applicable to clinician action. So for people who are interested in quality or operations or facilitating best practice, that's row number one. Research and innovation, as I said before, there's a lot we know. There's more that we don't know. And then finally, there are a lot of really outstanding clinician educators, both internally within healthcare and then as advocates for public health beyond the walls of our hospitals and clinics. We really need clinician involvement there as well. At the intersection between the columns and the rows, that's where you fill in the tactics or the projects specific to your specialty or your practice. You know, the things that I have listed here in this example are more perioperative, more anesthesiology driven. But I would encourage you to think carefully, go through this exercise and see what you come up with. Some people will be drawn more to quality, some will be drawn to research, some advocacy, some to education, but we really need clinicians engaged in all of these boxes. And with limited time, I think we should kind of give ourselves permission to not feel like we have to do everything. But if you can carve out one of these lines in one of these boxes and work on that, you will be doing us all a service. So once you have a target for your efforts, how can we start thinking about accelerating a transformation? In our work to date, we found that these three implementation strategies have been particularly effective in engaging clinicians and have resulted in significant environmental gains. Quality improvement programs, process re-engineering, and decision support tools. Clearly, there's a lot of crossover between the three, and they should be used together. But of the three, I'll really reveal my bias here, I guess. I think quality improvement is particularly relevant and an appropriate lens through which to advance clinical environmental stewardship across all those three pillars of adaptation, mitigation, and advocacy. And for quality, it's often considered within the context of value. We've all heard the term value-based healthcare. Most administrators are even familiar with that. I choose to think of it as value-based decarbonization. In the simplest terms, value is, quality divided by cost. And the important thing, I think, when designing and implementing a quality improvement project is carefully and very deliberately doing your best to assess and consider and assess all the aspects of quality and cost, not just the one that matters the most to you. I mean, clearly in my role, I'm going to prioritize the reduction of environmental costs. That's what's going to get me out of bed in the morning. That's what's going to get me to the table to have a discussion. But I'm not so naive to think that everybody that I encounter is going to share that same passion or priority. So within our program, we try to do our very best to assess each of these facets, because you never know who's going to be in your audience and what their priority is going to be. But if you present your proposed change and ground it in this complete assessment, then you'll significantly reduce barriers and you'll create this this group of advocates that really want to move along with you. I think clinicians are uniquely suited to inform and assess these facets of quality. Certainly within healthcare sustainability, historically, it's really been focused on the facilities, on the money, on energy, because most of those sustainability directors are not clinical, and they do not feel comfortable wading into aspects of patient safety, clinical efficacy, clinical efficiencies, health equity, patient-centered care, resilience they're more willing to talk about, and compliance is regulatory compliance. We want to make sure that we don't go sideways with regulators, with change, with the transformational changes that we propose. So in designing a strong environmental stewardship initiatives, I think it's helpful to think about the rule of fours. The SUSQI program from the Center of Sustainable Healthcare in the UK really grounds itself in these 4 principles of sustainable practice. I think it's an excellent resource to learn more about sustainable clinical care. If you haven't looked at it and you're interested, you absolutely should. I find it interesting and significant that that the framework starts upstream. I think that's very intentional. Prevention is the most effective means to reducing our healthcare emissions, our clinical healthcare emissions. If we can keep a patient from coming into the hospital, which consumes so many resources, not only are we keeping them healthy, we're reducing our emissions burden of the system itself as well. Patient empowerment and self-care, making sure that they understand how to take care of themselves at home, making sure that they're using their medications efficiently and appropriately. Lean service delivery is really working on efficiency. We get a lot of collaboration and cooperation with the teams working on value analysis within Providence. They're really focused on efficiency in terms of financial cost reduction. We're interested in looking at efficiency for environmental emissions and pollution reduction. It's a really powerful synergy to work on the efficiency of care. And then finally, we're working hard to understand lower carbon clinical alternatives within different facets of care. And oh, the circle of feedback is coming back, if you could turn that off. And I think a good example there is with anesthesia. We have several different inhaled anesthetics available for clinical use. They differ drastically in terms of their greenhouse gas potency, and we've led a very effective clinical quality improvement project to direct clinicians' behaviors toward the lower carbon alternatives. And as we learn more about, as we get better about the carbon accounting of clinical practice, we're able to make more and more recommendations to lower carbon alternatives, couched in the overarching context of always moving toward high value care. We don't want to propose something that's going to undermine safety, undermine efficacy. So that's, again, why it's so important to have clinician voices at the table when we're thinking through these problems. In terms of implementation, the other group of 4, this is just more my putting on my quality improvement hat, I guess, but I found these 4 components of implementation to be particularly effective and important when implementing a project. Grounding the change in true evidence-based rationale really serves to inspire clinicians to come on board. Within environmental stewardship, I would say kind of the standard of evidence is life cycle assessments of alternatives. And that's really, as this field expands, the number and breadth of life cycle assessments specific to healthcare is only getting larger. But that's what you really need to unravel this, the 4th line of sustainable practice of these lower carbon alternatives, you really need someone to go through the process of understanding, well, what are the emissions associated with resource extraction, with manufacturing, with transport, with use, with disposal, and really considering emissions over the entire life cycle, so that we make sure that the choices that we make are truly achieving the goal that we want of overall emissions reductions. Again, any quality improvement project, it's really important that it's iterative. You learn so much with every cycle run through the quality process. I spoke before about the importance of data, continuous data collection to inform the next iterations is absolutely critical. Feeding that data forward to the clinicians you're working with to continue to inspire engagement is also really important. And then finally, this is something that I've been doing more lately in this role, is thinking from the very beginning about how do we scale this quickly, right? It's one thing to do a quality improvement project in your clinic or at Providence Portland, and it's great, and it improves the care of those locations. But how do we get this spread quickly, right? How do we scale this up very quickly? And I think there are certainly ways to do that. It does require some careful consideration about how do you normalize your measurement of your initiative across practices that are very different from each other. The practice at Seaside Hospital is very different than the practices at St. Vincent. How do we put them on some kind of normalized scale so that we can understand and learn from each other? I know that was a lot to cover, and I apologize that maybe it seemed like we were skimming. We were skimming. Any of these topics is certainly worthy of an hour in and of itself. That said, I hope you leave today with at least these broad take-home points. Number one, that healthcare is this vicious cycle in the climate crisis and associated health impacts, where we serve both as a safety net to those suffering the impacts, as well as we need to take responsibility as significant contributors to the problem itself. Action is needed across several fronts: mitigation, adaptation, and advocacy. And then finally, I hope that you leave here with the appreciation that clinicians do have a crucial role to play as we approach these problems going forward. Normally in Providence, we offer reflections at the beginning, but I'd like to leave with this reflection here. Leonardo da Vinci's really acknowledging this gap that exists between knowledge and implementation. We know it takes, on average, 17 years between generation of evidence in medicine and widespread adoption of practice. We don't have 17 years to go through that with each of these. We need action. And Leonardo says, "I've been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being willing is not enough. We must do." So with that, I'll leave this contact info. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions or comments or suggestions. Really, I'd love to hear from you all about stewardship opportunities that you see in your practices. I always feel like I learn way more than I give. And finally, thanks for the invitation to be here. It's really an honor and a privilege. With that, I'm happy to take any questions that you have. So the question, for those who didn't hear it, was how is, and please tell me if I'm interpreting this properly, how does environmental stewardship and the work underway to reduce emissions, how is that in itself sustainable, given the financial pressures that we're all seeing in Providence and healthcare in general? Did I sum that up properly? Okay. That's a very good question. And it's something that we worry about a lot. But fortunately, there are so many examples where, again, improving the efficiency improves financial stewardship, improves environmental stewardship too. Not every environmental initiative is going to save us money. There are absolutely things that are going to cost us money. But within our program, we do have a tracking mechanism so that we're tracking use, emissions, and cost. So we know how much money we're saving system. We know how much money we're costing the system. And we're making sure that calculus makes sense. And we're making sure that our leaders know the financial benefit of our program to kind of help them, reassure them that what we're doing is not undermining the financial solvency of the organization. But I think it's important to also appreciate that the work exists grounded in the values of Providence. It is really grounded in justice. I can't tell you how powerful that is for our leaders. It opens a lot of doors that we have this mission. I feel very fortunate to be working on this topic within an organization that really holds onto its mission and values the way Providence does, because it does relieve some of that pressure from us, not completely. And we wouldn't be good stewards in the broader sense if we didn't take financial accounting of what we're doing as well. But I think our grounding in justice and the acknowledgement and understanding amongst our leaders that this is a health issue, that Providence will not survive if we don't address this problem. If we don't address the resilience of our infrastructure to climate, we will shut down. Very interesting story last year during the heat dome. St. Vincent was this close to shutting during that event. Talking to Andy Mason, the facility director here, about the operational gymnastics that they had to do to keep this building open, not only during the event itself, but for 10 days after the event. It was incredibly challenging for them to manage the internal environment of St. Vincent. There was so much thermal energy that had been absorbed into the physical structure of this building during the heat dome itself, that for 10 days afterward, as that thermal energy was moving back down its gradient, it was doing it in very unpredictable ways, and ways that were very difficult for them to manage temperature, humidity, and important pressure gradients within the building. He had also mentioned to me that without the remodel, the exterior remodel that had been done, he said there's no way that the building would have made it through that event. Without the new reflective skin, without the windows, like they wouldn't have made it through. Our buildings were not designed for that kind of environmental stress, but it happened. It's going to keep happening. And I think Providence overall recognizes the importance of building resilience amongst the system itself, amongst the populations we serve, and the patients we care for.
Very helpful. Thank you for your good work. I was really inspired by the anesthesia example, and I started wondering, did the British Medical Society or some other group generate like a top 5, kind of like the Choosing Wisely campaign around finances? Is there a top 5 for us as internists? One that comes to mind is just, are the powdered inhalers better than the ones that are metered dose? And if so, are there other projects that are top of mind for you or that the society has put forward?
Sure. So the inhalers is a good example. I mean, if you really think about what we have to take ownership of, I think it's really important that we take ownership of the emissions that are unique to healthcare, right? We're working on energy efficiency, we're working on transportation, Fortunately, other people are working on that too. We're going to benefit from this cross-industry collaboration on those emissions. So there's a lot of work for us to do, but other people are helping us. With healthcare, with unique sources of healthcare emissions, we have to own them. We have to take the lead. We have to figure out the solution. Anesthesia is one that we understand now. Right? We understand how to mitigate those sources of emissions. Of those two, there are two broad classes of anesthesia emissions. They're the more potent volatile anesthesia, more potent volatile inhaled anesthetics, and then there's nitrous oxide, which is used not only in anesthesia, but it's used in pediatric sedation. It's used as a refrigerant in cryosurgery, in the cath lab, in the cardiac surgery OR. We understand how to mitigate that source as well, the nitrous source and the volatile anesthetic source. At St. Vincent, again, since I'm standing here, both those sources have been reduced by over 95% from our baseline that we had in 2016 and 2019. So nearly 100% mitigation of those two sources that nobody else is going to help us figure out how to do. So that's a win, right? For internists, I would say the propellants those are significant. It kind of, when I first was learning about that, it seemed kind of hard to believe. I mean, those MDIs are so small. How could that be a problem? But when you multiply it out over the millions and millions of prescriptions per year, and you realize that the global warming potential of those propellants is many thousand times greater than carbon dioxide, it is a problem. The NHS estimates that the propellants from inhalers comprise roughly 5% of their entire industry's emissions. It's complicated. I mean, the anesthesia story is pretty straightforward. There are only 3 drugs. You know, it's pretty easy to measure. Inhaled medications is hundreds of drugs. It's with anesthesia, the clinical differences are very small. With inhaled medications, it's much more complicated, right? The drugs themselves are different. The diseases you're treating are different. Mild asthma is treated different than severe asthma, is treated differently than moderate COPD, right? So for that example, again, having clinicians who are experienced in the literature and treating patients, really that perspective needs to come into play in terms of making recommendations to drive toward higher value care so that we don't undermine clinical efficacy of our treatments, but that we are mindful of the environmental emissions of these inhalers. Some of the work that we've done here in Providence it was really kind of brutal, but going through the entire United States formulary, looking at every single formulation of every single inhaled medication, evaluating the type and the amount of propellant in each device, and translating it to emissions per treatment day, which I think is the most appropriate normalizer. You know, some medications you give 1 puff twice a day, some are 2 puffs 3 times a day, right? So you can't just compare device to device. You have to say, well, for the treatment of mild, moderate asthma, if I use this, it's this many emissions per treatment day. If I use this, it's different. Without question, the dry powdered inhalers are better from an emissions perspective. I'd be happy to share. I've done an assessment of the Providence inhaler footprint, and so I know what drugs are driving our emissions related to that. It's the short-acting beta agonists, albuterol, and it's combination therapies, inhaled corticosteroids, and long-acting beta agonists, particularly Symbicort. Symbicort, the propellant in Symbicort is the global warming potential of that propellant is roughly 3,000 times higher than CO2. Yeah, and that interestingly, not just to kind of climb up on that soapbox for a second, it's interesting to know also that the data looking at the use of Symbicort, those trials all use dry powdered inhalers, right? Dry powdered inhalers for Symbicort are not available in the United States. It's only available as an MDI. So in speaking about advocacy, one of the things that we're pushing on the FDA is to get the dry powdered Symbicort into the United States. So we're trying to do that so that we can truly follow the evidence and we can reduce the emissions associated with that treatment. With short-acting beta agonists, the formulations are different. If you don't do that assessment of the formulary, the point of we found that depending on what brand of albuterol you buy, the emissions vary by a factor of 3 to 4. Right? They don't all have the same amount of pound. They're delivering the same dose of medicine. They have the same number of actuations, 4 times different emissions. And you guys don't know that, but you should.
This specific example so resonates. I want to call out that we're at time and just want to draw in one question from the audience online for you to repeat and then address briefly. Is Providence pursuing solar energy production? Seems like there are a lot of rooftop real estate on our hospitals and clinics for solar panels.
Sure. So the question was, is Providence pursuing solar installations and direct renewable energy installations on our campuses? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is we don't have enough real estate for that to be a linchpin solution to our energy problem. Our energy consumption is enormous. We cannot generate enough of our own renewable energy to make that up. We are aggressively looking at partnering with utility providers to procure renewable energy to cover our consumption. We prioritize projects that have what we call additionality, meaning that we're not just going out to the market and buying. I mean, we are doing this too, but we aren't relying just on what's already available in the market, right? That indirectly improves the grid. We're looking at more direct improvements to the grid, expanding the capacity of the grid for renewable energy by partnering with utility providers and others to build additional installations. Well, maybe not on our campuses, certainly within the region is our priority, or the country is our next priority. So working on it, that's pretty complicated. But you know, several of our campuses do have renewable energy. Centralia Hospital in Washington has the largest solar array of any hospital in Washington. So we are putting effort into it, but we're not relying upon that as the linchpin to our energy problem.
I suspect we better let you go. Thank you very much.